For years, Drake Bell was a name that brought smiles to millions. As the star of the hit Nickelodeon series Drake and Josh, his face was a symbol of teenage mischief and brotherly bonds. But in 2021, a shocking revelation shattered the image many had held onto for more than a decade. News broke that Bell had been charged with felony attempted child endangerment and disseminating material harmful to juveniles. Fans were stunned. How could the boy who once sang about found dreams and innocent adventures find himself facing such serious accusation? The incident stemmed from interactions that began in 2017 when a then 15-year-old girl attended one of Bell's concerts in Cleveland, Ohio. According to prosecutors, Bell and the girl had developed an online relationship that culminated in their meeting at the event. The charges indicated that Bell's communication with the minor had been inappropriate and that he had endangered her welfare through his action. As news outlets scrambled to piece the story together, the clean and charming image Drake Bell had crafted over the years started to crumble in the public eye. Initially, Bell pleaded not guilty, fueling speculation that the charges might have been exaggerated or misunderstood. But those hopes were quickly dashed when he ultimately accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to both charges, setting the stage for a deeply emotional and public reckoning. During the court proceedings, it was revealed that Bell had sent inappropriate social media messages to the minor, some of which were described as suggestive and harmful. The girl, whose identity was kept confidential, described feeling manipulated and betrayed by someone she had idolized. She accused Bell of grooming behavior starting when she was as young as 12, in the face of mounting evidence and emotional testimony. Bell's defense argued that no explicit images were exchanged and that there was no physical sexual contact. However, the damage to Bell's reputation was irreversible. The image of the clean-cut Nickelodeon star was forever stained, replaced by headlines labeling him a fallen icon who had crossed unforgivable lines. In July 2021, Drake Bell was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. While he avoided jail time, the court of public opinion delivered its own sentence of harsh judgment and lost adoration. Bell issued a public apology during sentencing, acknowledging that his behavior had been wrong and irresponsible. However, he also insisted that many of the more extreme allegations against him were false or exaggerated. He admitted to engaging in inappropriate conversations, but emphasized that he ceased communication when he realized the girl's age. It was a complicated moment, a mixture of admission, apology, denial, and regret. And for millions who grew up watching him, it was a heartbreaking reminder that the idols of childhood are often far more flawed than the characters they portray. But this was only the beginning. As the court case concluded, another chapter of Drake Bell's life was poised to emerge, one filled with trauma, personal battles, and revelations about the darker forces that had shaped his life long before he ever met his accuser. As Drake Bell stood before the court, the weight of his actions seemed to press visibly upon his shoulders. Once adored by millions as a symbol of teenage innocence and fun, he now faced the somber reality of public shame. Gone was the charismatic smile and boyish charm that had made him a household name. In its place stood a man who looked smaller, more fragile, and painfully aware of the irreversible damage done to his reputation and to the young girl whose life he had impacted forever. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of tension as the judge called the session to order. The victim, now 19 years old, stepped forward to deliver her statement. Her voice, though steady, carried an unmistakable tremor, betraying the deep emotional wounds that her words attempted to express. She spoke about how Bell had groomed her, how he had used his fame and status to build trust with her when she was only 12 years old, and how that trust slowly turned into a relationship that blurred all boundaries of safety and innocence. Her accusations were detailed and gut-wrenching. She described feeling special at first, chosen by someone she admired, only to realize over time that the attention she had once craved had turned into something manipulative and harmful. She alleged that Bell had sent her inappropriate messages, that their communication had become suggestive and sexual by the time she was 15, and that he had used his position to control and influence her emotionally. She fought back tears as she detailed how the experience had shattered her ability to trust others, how it had haunted her into adulthood. Bell listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, barely moving. His defense team had already prepared a statement emphasizing that while Bell had communicated inappropriately, there was no evidence of explicit photos or sexual encounters, and that he had ceased communication upon realizing the girl's true age. Yet, the emotional impact of the victim's statement was undeniable. It painted a picture not just of legal wrongdoing, but of deep psychological harm that could not simply be erased with an apology or community service hours. The prosecution emphasized that Bell's actions constituted more than just poor judgment. They represented a pattern of exploiting the admiration and trust of a vulnerable young fan. Although the legal system could only act on what could be proven and no physical evidence of sexual acts was presented, the emotional abuse, the manipulation, and the betrayal were clear. They pushed for a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the psychological damage inflicted. When it was Bell's turn to speak, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as he addressed the victim directly and the court at large. "I am sorry for the hurt I have caused," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My behavior was inexcusable. I made terrible mistakes and I accept responsibility for my actions." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "I never intended to cause harm, but I realize now that intentions are meaningless when the result is pain." Despite his apology, reactions outside the courtroom were deeply divided. Some believed he had shown genuine remorse. Others saw his words as too little, too late, a scripted performance designed to salvage whatever was left of his crumbling career. The court sentenced him to 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. While he avoided prison time, the damage to his career, his public image, and his personal life was beyond repair. Media coverage was relentless. Every detail of the trial, every word of the victim's statement, every tear Bell shed was dissected, analyzed, and broadcast to an audience that had once adored him. Former fans flooded social media with posts ranging from sorrow to outrage. Memes mocked his fall from grace. Commentators debated whether the punishment fit the crime, whether justice had truly been served, and what it meant for a generation who had grown up seeing him as a beloved figure. Behind the scenes, the consequences were even more severe. Bell's music deals dried up, invitations to industry events were rescinded, brand endorsements vanished overnight. The industry that once celebrated his talents now treated his name like a liability. Financial strain loomed as legal fees mounted, and income streams collapsed. Bell retreated from the spotlight, isolated not only by public scorn, but also by his own mounting guilt and despair. Yet as the months passed, another layer of Drake Bell's story would slowly come to light. A layer that revealed he too had once been a victim. A revelation that would complicate the narrative even further and force the world to confront an uncomfortable truth about cycles of abuse, broken trust, and the long shadows that early trauma can cast over a lifetime. The story of Drake Bell was no longer just about a celebrity scandal. It was about the devastating consequences of betrayal, the ripple effects of pain, and the haunting question of whether healing was ever truly possible for those caught in the aftermath of broken innocence. In the months that followed Drake Bell's sentencing, the dust of the courtroom seemed to settle, but the aftershocks of his actions rippled through every corner of his life. His legacy, once filled with admiration and nostalgia, became a subject of discomfort and controversy. Former co-stars distanced themselves silently. Networks that had once aired endless reruns of Drake and Josh quietly phased out the show from their schedules. For those who grew up watching Bell, the betrayal was profound, and the question lingered heavily in the air. How could someone who brought laughter to millions be capable of such deep harm? The entertainment industry, known for its rapid shifts of loyalty, moved on without him. No new offers came. Studios that might once have capitalized on his name now considered him too toxic to touch. The world of entertainment is often brutal, and for Drake Bell, the consequences of his actions were swift and unrelenting. Interviews he had given in the past resurfaced, with fans dissecting every old comment for hidden signs of the man he had become. Once charming anecdotes about his life on set were now viewed under the harsh light of hindsight, often interpreted as early warnings that no one had recognized. Bell attempted to pivot quietly to a music career, releasing new songs independently. but his efforts were met with cold silence or outright hostility. Venues canceled shows after public backlash. Social media, once a tool he had used to connect with fans, became a battleground filled with anger, disgust, and disappointment. No apology seemed sufficient to undo the betrayal that his victims and supporters alike felt. Even casual mentions of his name sparked debates about forgiveness, accountability, and the burden celebrities bear when their private failures come into public view. As he faced the collapse of his career, Bell also confronted his internal demons. Away from the cameras and headlines, he entered therapy, seeking to understand the broken parts of himself that had led him down such a destructive path. It was during these private sessions that he finally spoke openly about his own trauma, revealing that he had been a victim of sexual abuse during his early years in the industry. The abuser was none other than Brian Peck, a dialogue coach who had worked with many young actors at Nickelodeon. The revelation added complexity to Bell's story, but did not excuse his actions. It offered a painful context, not a justification. Peck had been convicted in 2004 of sexually abusing a minor on set, but for years the extent of his influence and the silence surrounding his crimes had remained buried. Bell's admission reignited conversations about the entertainment industry's systemic failures, about how young talents are often left vulnerable, unprotected, and scarred by those meant to guide them. For Bell, coming forward was not about erasing his guilt, but about facing the full truth of his life. In interviews, he expressed a desire to break the cycle of silence and shame that had haunted him. "Acknowledging my own abuse does not excuse my mistakes," he said in a rare, emotionally raw interview. "But maybe by telling the truth, I can help someone else find their voice before it is too late." Still, public forgiveness remained elusive. For many, the wounds were too fresh, too deep. Fans who had once idolized him now struggled with the dissonance between the character they loved and the man he had revealed himself to be. Parents, wary of what he represented, warned their children about trusting public figures. His scandal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of celebrity worship and the painful realization that fame often hides deep fractures behind its glossy surface. Bell's personal life suffered as well. Friends who once stood by him disappeared. Relationships grew strained and distant. Loneliness crept into the spaces that once were filled with admiration and adulation. Financial pressures mounted, lawsuits loomed, mental health battles intensified. It became clear that while he had avoided prison, he had sentenced himself to a life of rebuilding from ashes, if rebuilding was even possible. By early 2022, Bell had all but disappeared from the public eye. His social media accounts grew quiet. Occasional paparazzi shots showed a man aged beyond his years, carrying the heavy burden of regret and isolation. The boy who once sang about finding his way had become a man wandering through the wreckage of his own choices. In the end, Drake Bell's story was no longer just about one scandal. It was about the high cost of fame, the tragic patterns of abuse, the failures of institutions that should have protected the young and the vulnerable. It was a story about accountability, about facing one's demons without excuses, and about the brutal reality that not every fall from grace ends in redemption. As the world moved forward, Bell remained a painful reminder that childhood heroes are not immune to human flaws, and that the harm done in the shadows eventually demands its day in the light. In the months after his sentencing, Drake Bell lived in a strange kind of limbo. He was free, technically, allowed to move about, to live his life, to rebuild. Yet in every meaningful way, he was imprisoned by the consequences of his action. The court's judgment had been merciful compared to the relentless verdict delivered by the public. Online, Bell's name became synonymous with betrayal. Every post he made, no matter how benign, was flooded with reminders of his crime. There was no escaping the label that now clung to him: fallen idol, disgraced star, predator. Social media was unforgiving. In an age where cancellation could spread faster than wildfire, Bell's name became a warning to others. Some former fans defended him weakly, arguing for forgiveness, pointing to his admission of guilt and apology. But the overwhelming majority rejected these arguments. To them, Bell's sins were not momentary lapses, but deep betrayals of trust that could not simply be brushed aside. The girl he had hurt was not a nameless stranger to them. She was every young fan who had ever looked up to a celebrity and believed they were safe in their admiration. Bell attempted to stay active musically, posting snippets of songs and announcing small projects. Yet every effort was overshadowed by the scandal. His new music videos drew more criticism than views. Concert promoters refused to book him. Radio stations declined to play his song. Opportunities evaporated one by one. Even those who might have been willing to work with him quietly backed away, unwilling to risk their own reputations. Bell became isolated, not just from the industry, but from the life he had once known. Behind the scenes, the emotional toll was devastating. Bell's marriage, which had once been a private source of strength, began to show cracks. Friends disappeared, not with anger, but with a heavy silence that was almost worse. The people who had once laughed at his jokes, who had once celebrated his victories, now treated him like a ghost. Therapy sessions revealed just how deep the wounds ran. His guilt, his shame, his self-loathing, all intertwined with the long-buried trauma of his own past abuses. He often sat alone late into the night, replaying memories over and over in his mind. Childhood moments, career milestones, conversations with fans, all colored now with regret and disbelief. He wondered where it had all gone wrong, whether there had ever been a moment when he could have made a different choice, when he could have broken the cycle instead of continuing it. These thoughts haunted him, gnawed at him, eroded what little hope he clung to. In interviews, Bell spoke cautiously about his future. He wanted to help others, he said. He wanted to be an advocate for victims of abuse. But he also knew that words meant little without action, and in a world that no longer trusted him, even the purest intentions could be met with cynicism. His pleas for understanding were often drowned out by accusations that he was only seeking redemption for personal gain. Every step forward seemed blocked by invisible walls built from his own mistakes. Meanwhile, the girl he had hurt struggled too. Though she had found a voice in the courtroom, the process of healing was far from over. Survivors of grooming and emotional manipulation often face a lifetime of recovery, and the public nature of her case only made it harder. She had become a symbol for others, but at the cost of her privacy, her peace. In many ways, she too was a prisoner of the events set in motion years before. Organizations advocating for child safety used Bell's case as a rallying cry. They pointed to the dangers of unchecked celebrity influence, to the need for stronger protections for young fans, especially in online spaces where predators could exploit adoration for sinister ends. Lawsuits were filed against other former child stars and coaches, uncovering a pattern of abuse and silence that had festered in the industry for decades. Bell's downfall was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systemic failure that had left countless children vulnerable. For Bell, this realization brought bitter clarity. His fame had given him opportunities, but it had also shielded him from accountability for too long. He had made choices, terrible, inexcusable choices, and now he was forced to live in the ruins they created. There were days, he thought, about disappearing completely, about leaving Los Angeles, changing his name, starting over somewhere no one knew him. But deep down, he knew that no physical distance could outrun the moral consequences he carried inside. By late 2022, Bell had retreated almost entirely from the public eye. His rare appearances were marked by visible anxiety and exhaustion. The vibrant performer he had once been was a shadow now, moving carefully, speaking cautiously, trying to survive a world that no longer welcomed him. Whether redemption was even possible remained uncertain. What was certain was that the scars left by his actions, both on himself and on those he had harmed, would never fully heal. Drake Bell's story was no longer just a scandal splashed across headlines. It had become a parable of lost innocence, of betrayal's heavy cost, and of the long, painful journey toward whatever future could be salvaged from the wreckage. As the world moved forward, Drake Bell remained suspended in a strange and painful space between public memory and public disdain. His name still surfaced occasionally, dragged into conversations about fallen celebrities, about broken childhood dreams, about the dangerous illusions of fame. But for the most part, he faded into the background, a man forced to reckon with his past in the quiet shadows, far from the screaming crowds that once cheered his every move. Bell's attempts at a private life were riddled with obstacles. Even simple activities, like shopping for groceries or visiting a restaurant, were haunted haunted by lingering stares and whispered accusation. In many ways, he wore an invisible scarlet letter, a symbol of betrayal that no apology or time could wash away. Some encounters were hostile, filled with anger and judgment. Others were simply cold, the kind of indifference that cuts deeper than rage. Both were constant reminders that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be hard-earned and painfully slow. Inside his own mind, the battles raged harder still. Therapy sessions continued, peeling back layer after layer of pain that had built up since his earliest years in the entertainment industry. He spoke often about cycles, how the cycles of abuse and silence had shaped him, how his failure to break them had destroyed not just his own life but others as well. Facing these truths was brutal. Some days, he fought through the guilt and shame. Other days, he drowned in it, overwhelmed by the enormity of the damage he had caused. Professionally, Bell's world had shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. Independent music releases attracted only a handful of listeners, many of whom seemed more curious about the scandal than genuinely interested in the art. Opportunities to act were non-existent. Even efforts to work behind the scene, writing, music, or producing content for others met resistance. His name was too toxic, his presence too controversial. For a man who had spent nearly his entire life in front of cameras and microphones, the silence was both a punishment and a profound loss. And yet, in rare interviews and private conversations, Bell occasionally spoke of hope. Hope not for fame, not for reclaiming his former life, but for finding some form of peace. He talked about using his story, the whole messy, painful truth of it, to educate others, to warn about the dangers of grooming, to advocate for stronger protections for young people navigating the treacherous world of fame and fandom. Whether the public would ever accept him in such a role remained uncertain. But for Bell, the desire to make something good, however small, from the wreckage was real. Meanwhile, the girl at the center of the scandal moved forward with her own journey of healing. Protected by privacy laws and a network of advocates, she worked to rebuild her life beyond the shadow of the court case. Her bravery in speaking out had inspired others to come forward, to break their own silence, to demand better safeguards against the kind of manipulation she had suffered. Though her scars were deep, they became a testament to resilience rather than a symbol of defeat. The broader industry, too, faced a reckoning. Conversations about child safety, about the responsibilities of adults in positions of power, became louder and harder to ignore. Organizations dedicated to protecting young performers grew in influence. Studios implemented stricter policies. The culture of silence that had allowed predators to operate unchecked for so long began, slowly, to crack. Drake Bell's fall from grace had illuminated not just one man's failures, but an entire system's negligence. For Bell himself, the path forward remained uncertain. Redemption stories are complicated, and for some actions, forgiveness feels impossible. He could never undo the hurt he had caused. No amount of charity work or private remorse could erase the harm. All he could do was continue to confront his failures, continue to seek healing, and accept that some mistakes leave permanent scars, not just on the victims, but on the perpetrators as well. As of 2024, Drake Bell lives largely away from the spotlight. Reports suggest he continues to attend counseling, to work on music quietly, to focus on repairing his relationship with his family and rebuilding what little he can of his life. He remains a controversial figure, a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those who seem closest to innocence can fall to darkness. In the end, his future remains unwritten. Whether he will one day find peace, whether he can truly change the narrative of his life, is something time alone will reveal. But the story of Drake Bell, once defined by laughter and light-hearted songs, now stands as a somber testament to the consequences of broken trust, the devastating power of silence, and the difficult road to redemption that not all are able or willing to walk.